Now I hear some amplification. All right, good to see everyone here this morning. We are in Judges 10 and 11. We have finished up the kind of bizarre side story of Abimelech, who's not really a judge and not really a foreign oppressor, but more just a general pain and a person who's trying to assert himself over the nation, trying to establish himself as king. And he went on quite a violent rampage there for a while. But that was over pretty quickly. That only lasted for a few years, and history marches on. So question number one, who are God's next two judges? Tola and Jair, yes. So these are some minor judges again, not necessarily because they did less than other judges, but just because there's not a whole lot that's said about them. This is a little bit like Shamgar that we saw before, where you have just the one or two verses about him, and then we move right on to the next story. So I want to highlight a couple things for you about Tola and Jair, just from what we have, a couple of interesting things that might make us raise an eyebrow, but ultimately there's not too many conclusions we can draw from these two. So Tola, there's something a little unusual about him. It said he's a man of Issachar, but he lived in the hill country of Ephraim, so he's away from the land that is given to his people. He's not part of his own tribe, at least from where he lives. And then we have a special kind of three-generation identification of him. He's Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar. And that sort of construction is sometimes used for prominent people, for powerful people who have some sort of status or title, or even royalty. So it's possible he was a man of status. It's possible that he had some significant resources, but ultimately we just don't know a whole lot about him. Other than that, in verse 2, it says he judged Israel 23 years. He did save Israel from somebody, verse 1, but the oppressor is not even identified here for us. Ultimately, this is just one of the judges, and we progress on to the next one. Jair, I think, is a little bit more interesting because we have several unusual things said about him in just these couple verses. He is obviously a very powerful person. It says that he judged Israel for 22 years, and he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 cities, which maybe sounds a little bit humorous to us, like this is the start to a children's book or something, but this is actually a sign of power, a sign of some serious influence. You really only get to 30 sons with a harem, and so if he's got a harem and his 30 sons are all riding donkeys, which at the time was a symbol of power, a symbol of having a title and having status, and these 30 sons each control a city, and this whole area becomes named after Jair, Havoth Jair. Well, we get the idea that he was a very, very powerful person. And right on the heels of the whole Abimelech story, it really makes me think of Abimelech. That somehow Jair has seized power, that he has established a kind of dynasty for his sons there. They're controlling a very wide area of land. And you'll also notice that this is a judge with a glaring omission. Even for a minor judge, there's a glaring omission here. Do you see something that isn't here that we should be expecting? It doesn't actually say he saved Israel from anything. It says he judged Israel, but it doesn't say that he saved Israel from anything or anyone. And that's very unusual. We haven't seen that up to this point. Even with Shamgar, even with Tola, they saved Israel from someone. But Jair hasn't actually saved anyone, not that is said here. So there's some reason to believe that he may have been more like an Abimelech, something between Abimelech and one of these other judges. That being said, he is referred to as a judge when Abimelech was not. I just imagine that he was a very self-interested one based on the few details that are shared with us. All right, so that's Tola and Jair. They had 23 and 22 years, respectively. And we move on to our next major judge, which is Jepthah. So question number 2, we see that Israel has gone into more wickedness again. They've done evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. That's a long list of foreign gods that they're worshiping. So question number 2, what did God do because of Israel's wickedness?
Sold them into their hands.
Yes, it's deja vu. He sold them into the hands of oppressors. This time it's 2 different oppressors. That's a little unusual, but it's the Philistines and it is the Ammonites. And they're both going to cause a lot of problems for Israel for the next 18 years, is what we're told. But the story is going to focus more on the Ammonites. Question number 3, what was God's response to Israel's cry this time? Because we see the same sort of thing where they get into trouble, and then verse 10, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you because we have forsaken our God and have served the Baals. What's God's response to this?
Go to your idols that you've been worshiping and get help from them.
Yeah. This is a little bit like what we saw with Gideon, right? When the people cried out in the days of Gideon, God first raised up a prophet to tell them, this is your own fault. God waits a little bit before he actually delivers them, and he tells them that you have brought this upon yourselves. This time it's even like another half step further, in that it's not raising up a prophet exactly, but it's God telling them directly, I have saved you enough times. I have saved you and delivered you from all sorts of oppressors, from Egypt, all the way through these different generations, through these different oppressors that have made your lives so difficult and made your father's lives so difficult. And you ask for help again. Go to the gods that you have chosen. Let them help you. So what do you think about that? Dave?
For the sin, it's better to ask for, when he's going to ask for forgiveness and his permission.
Mm-hmm.
And God, I think that I could be wrong on this, but I think this is one of the first, if not the first, recorded time that God said, I've had it with you.
Yeah.
I'm done. You know, and that you have to they had to have been really just driving God nuts, because time and time again he pulled them out and they just went right back to the big false gods. And so it's no wonder that he did that. That's a huge lesson for us.
Yeah.
God does have a limit.
Yeah.
On our rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely.
We think that, he'll just forgive us, I'll just repent. And that's good, we can't. But if you go right back, I repent just to get out of it, and you come back and start doing it again and again and again, this is what happens.
Yeah, at some point, like repentance, you expect there to be a change of action, a change of the choices that they're making. They're going in the same cycle. Like, aren't you getting tired of this cycle by now, just us studying through it? Like, this is exhausting to read. This just spiral of them doing the same thing over and over, of getting worse and worse. It's not even like they keep falling into sin, but they're learning lessons from it and they're slowly improving and getting better. They're not. They're not getting better. They're getting worse. They're falling into a lot of sin, and They keep going back to their idols. It's so important to them to worship these other gods. This time we see, but it's not just a few. They're worshiping the gods of every neighbor around them. And so God says, go to the gods that you have chosen and let them save you. Yeah, Dave.
Do you think this might be a test about see how they really meant it this time? Or do you think God knows everything,
Yeah.
so I'm at a little impasse on that. God already knew,
Yeah.
But here he says, I'm not doing it anymore. I will deliver you no more.
Yeah, I think with like the progression we're seeing throughout Judges, and what we're going to see with Jepthah here, Jepthah's kind of a worthless man who is a judge for them. That the idea we're supposed to get across is that the idea of it's being put across to us is that Israel is getting worse and worse, and God's patience is wearing thin. And they shouldn't be surprised when eventually God does not want to show them mercy any longer. And so there's some degree of this that is a test for them, because even in the times that they have pushed God to his limit, like there's still an opportunity for them to repent, and he is going to deliver them here. But at the same time, they need to understand that it needs to create lasting change. It cannot be this cycle forever. A big thing that's going to change when we get through the book of Judges is we'll get to a different mode of leadership for the nation. That they're going to get a king who is supposed to be able to rule them better. Their desire for a king comes out of their own wickedness and their own desire to be like the peoples around them. But having a king could be a good thing in giving them more unified leadership and more of a national push to serve God. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out that way in most of the kings that Israel and Judah have. But nevertheless, that is an option. And all this is looking forward to a time generations in the future when God is going to deliver the people up into captivity. So, Mark.
I just think it's interesting to note that they were probably not thinking they had replaced God. They were probably thinking he is just one God of many.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. They are locked into this polytheistic idea that there are many spiritual forces around them, there are many gods around them, and we have our God. He is our national God, and he has done a lot for us. But there are other gods too, and you need to respect them and look at how powerful the people around us are. We need to worship their gods. And get the blessings that come from them. It's a very open kind of mindset to all of the spiritual influences that there could be for them. So, yeah, they're not believing that they have given up on God or replaced God, but at the same time, they have broken the key element of the covenant where God said, "You shall have no other gods before me." And God makes sure that they know that he's not pleased with them, and that they should not expect that he's just going to jump and do their bidding. So what did Israel do hearing this message from God?
They put away all their idols and worshiped God.
Yeah. They cried out again. They begged for mercy. They put those foreign gods away. And God, it says that God became impatient over the misery of Israel, which is interesting. God sees the cycle that's happening, and he's impatient over it. He's not very happy with how this is progressing. He's going to deliver them, but he's not very happy about how things are going, even still. So now we get to Jepthah. Well, is there anything else you want to bring up in chapter 10 before Jepthah is actually introduced? Yes.
You don't
Yeah. Yeah, so there are some textual differences on that, and I wondered if that might get brought up. Maybe I should have just brought it up from the from the get-go. Yeah, some of the translations read differently on that, and some of that is down to textual difference. One reading does make it sound more like that God was sad to see the misery they were going through and wanted to deliver them, and the other reading makes it seem like that he is still impatient with them and impatient with the fact that they've brought this upon themselves. Probably both of those things are true to a degree, right? Because God does experience sorrow when we are going through pain, even pain that is self-inflicted. And so there is a reason why God chose to deliver them. He did not have to. He could have said enough is enough, and he kind of did, but he delivered them anyway, in part due to that sorrow that he feels, that pity that he feels for them. At the same time, I don't think we should overlook the fact that God's patience is wearing thin, and that's an important element to the book of Judges. And that is true with the kinds of people that he raises up for them to deliver them. He's picking worse and worse people to give them a different sort of deliverance. And that's a reflection of the worsening state of the people. Alan?
Yeah, I was going to say the Strong says on that word, ineffective or powerless over free will.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of like says exactly what you said.
Yeah. It's an interesting verse. There's some interesting nuance to it there. And the translations differ a little just because it is, it's an interesting nuance either way on it. But what we should understand from this is the complex emotions that God feels about this, the complex situation that Israel has put themselves into, that they're continuing to bring pain upon themselves while still trying to cry out to God and get some sort of deliverance. For now, they're going to get that, but you should feel something looming over Israel's head the deeper we get into Judges. Okay. So, Jephthah, chapter 11. Question number 5 asks, was Jephthah's beginning noble?
No,
No, it was not. Why? What are we talking about here?
he was the son of a harlot.
Okay. Yeah, so he's the son of a prostitute. He can't help that, right? You don't get to choose who your parents are. Nevertheless, he is the son of a prostitute, and he's rejected by his family. He does not have a position of honor among them. And so when they have all grown up, his half-brothers drive Jephthah out from among them, and they say, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." So they don't want anything to do with him. He is a dishonor to them, but Jephthah has done a little bit more to make himself have this kind of ignoble beginning.
Well, he kind of gathered himself on a lawless crew, so they were kind
Yeah,
of, I don't know what lawless involves back in that day, but
yeah.
whatever a bunch of guys were lawless do.
Yeah, exactly. So, my translation uses the good worthless fellows collected around Jephthah, lawless people, generally not productive people in society, people who are going to be involved in crime and violence and trouble. Yes, Kat?
Well, others did the same thing. David had people come to him who were kind of lawless when he first had to
Yeah.
flee. So there were others that had the same thing.
Yeah. So in this case, Jephthah is choosing to associate himself with these unholy people, unrighteous people, and presumably he's involved in things that he doesn't need to be.
Well, it's a little ironic considering some of the things he says and does later on.
Yeah. There's a lot of ironic things about Jephthah. His story is interesting for a lot of reasons. But you got to know where he began. He began from a place of dishonor. He began from a place of not being a productive member of society, not being a particularly righteous person, associating with evil people. Yes?
Well, the first thing it says, though, is that he was a mighty warrior.
Yes. So he is a mighty warrior. He certainly has the physical and martial prowess to be able to fight. That's not necessarily a good thing when you're surrounded by worthless fellows, and that you're maybe going to use that prowess in ways that you should not. I don't know if this means that he was, a highway, robber, a bandit, that he was a thief, he was a hired muscle to do harm to people. I don't know exactly what form this worthlessness took, but he's not a very noble person to begin with. Mark.
Yeah, that's one of those things where it really wasn't his decision. He had to do that. It really was it. He had no choice in the matter, because he was driven out. It doesn't say this, but I would assume that his brothers, they didn't want, well, it says they didn't want to divide any of the inheritance.
Yeah.
What was he going to do? He was either going to make himself a slave to somebody, or
Yeah.
he was going to do this. So he didn't have a whole lot of choices.
Yeah.
He, being a mighty man of valor, wasn't about to make himself a slave.
Yeah.
So to him, this was a natural thing to do, and I think that if any of us were in the same position, we would have done the same thing.
Yeah, we can understand why he made the choices he made. We can see the bind that he's put in. Nevertheless, we're left with this understanding that this is not exactly Othniel, right? Othniel, as our first judge, was mighty and righteous and this staunch defender of God and of the covenant that God had with the people. And we've fallen pretty far now. By the time we're here at Jephthah, we're at somebody who is associating with worthless people, who is on the margins of society. Whatever his justifications or story that gets to that point, we've fallen a long way.
Well, it doesn't exactly come out of a nation of
Excuse me?
honorable. He doesn't come out of a nation of honorable people.
Yeah.
God was tired of these people because they were
Right.
so wicked. So
Yes, exactly. So remember, all these judges are meant to reflect the state of the people as a whole, the nation as a whole. So the fact that Jephthah is so dishonorable is a reflection of what we're seeing out of God's people, which makes sense. That is what we identified in chapter 10. Dave.
When he was not raised to be godly, first off.
Sure.
That's to me is why they mentioned he was a son of Harm.
Yeah.
She obviously isn't going to teach him, you go do this while I go do that. Same stuff.
Yeah.
So, for me, when we look at the choices that were available to him, or that he made, he didn't consider going on a righteous path.
Right.
Because it wasn't instilled in him as a youth.
Right.
However, the choices he did make, obviously had the repercussions for it. But it's interesting how people today use that. So I had to. I was hungry, or I empathize with that. But it does not, cannot, and never will justify sin before God.
Yeah.
Just because you were raised by a harlot and you didn't have those choices. There's plenty of opportunities, I'm sure, that you could have sought that out.
Yeah.
So it's something I would be careful of, because saying that if we don't quantify it and qualify it, because that's like saying, well, I was raised in a trailer in Cold Arkansas. No offense against Arkansas, but my daddy had a still, so that made it okay.
Yeah.
I need money, so I need stealing, that's okay.
Yeah.
No, it's not. So, just wanted to.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you, because I don't think that Jephthah's actions are justified by God or are righteous in any way. That's definitely my read on the situation here, that we're supposed to understand that Jephthah is dishonorable and unrighteous. At the same time, we can understand the choices that he made, which I think what Mark is getting at there. But you can see the bind that Jephthah is in, and this just goes on to show the consequences of sin, even the consequences of sins that he wasn't involved in. You know, how his father has solicited this prostitute, and so now that's his lineage. This has created ripple effects that are now making things more difficult. Jephthah doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of options at this point, but he has chosen some not good things at the same time. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with all.
Yeah.
It really plays into what you're talking about, which is the degradation of the culture in general.
Yes.
And we see it play out again with Hosea, although Hosea is seeking to do God's will. He has to do some terrible things. He has to marry a woman who's promiscuous. And God is that's the representation of him disassociating himself from his people. And I think what you're saying, this is what he's doing to him.
Yeah.
In the census.
Yeah. In many ways, like, we're getting more deja vu from Gideon, right? Because Gideon was raised by a father who had erected this statue to Baal, this idol to Baal. He doesn't have particularly good godly influence. And so it is easy for us to understand why Gideon's faith is weak at the beginning. At the same time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be critiqued, that it needs to be justified in every way. But we can understand that a person can start out not knowing a whole lot or not having particularly good character, and it will become interesting to see what choices are made going forward. Gideon did this arc, basically, that he started out pretty low, ended up doing some righteous things for a while, and then fell again as he found success and found victory. Jephthah is not even going to be that good. Jephthah will find victory for Israel, but he's not going to do it in a good way. It's going to create a lot of trouble. So yes, understand that Jephthah is an unrighteous, dishonorable person. We can maybe understand some of the choices that he made without justifying them. But this is meant to be a reflection of the general weakness and degradation of Israel.
But he is mentioned in Hebrews 11.
He is mentioned in Hebrews 11. We've mentioned this throughout Judges, right? That some of these people being in Hebrews 11, it's interesting. Samson will be as well, and he's even at the tail end of this. So I think this is a reflection of the fact that, like, certain faithful deeds can be identified, and that God, like, we can see examples of faith while there are still other problems and other sins that need to be dealt with. Okay, let me see here. Okay, so question 6: does God use Jephthah despite his beginnings? And what do we learn about that? Yes.
I believe he does.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout this, we see the Lord's with him. The Lord
Yeah.
influences him, but he's not chosen by the Lord. He's not chosen by God like some of the others. God chose them for that, but he wasn't necessarily chosen by God.
Yeah, so God is able to use him. Yeah, there is kind of a distinct lack of that God raised up verse. That is missing here. Yet God does seem to be using Jephthah and working with Jephthah.
And Jephthah seems to have quite a working knowledge of the history
Mhm.
of the Jewish people. He understands and recites that history. So he seems to be educated
Yeah,
in the scriptures
yeah.
in some form.
Right. Yeah, he does know some of what has gone on. He knows the history of his people. He knows at least some things about God and about the covenant that they're under. This makes it hard to completely cast Jephthah in just one light because, well, like most of us, Jephthah is complicated.
He kind of trusts the Lord more than anybody else seems to, because he says, if the Lord gives this to me, then I know that it's meant to be.
Yeah.
He doesn't just, yeah, I'll take that position.
Yeah.
He actually predicates it on whether God's with him or not.
Yeah. Very interesting. Like with Gideon, we see there's opportunities here for Jephthah to learn a lot, to grow a lot. He's not starting from zero. Even with some significant issues, he's not starting from zero. And he has the potential to really blossom like we all do. It doesn't quite play out that way, unfortunately, but it is at least noteworthy. So I think we learn from this that God can absolutely use whoever he wants to use to accomplish his purpose. God does not require flawless people in order to accomplish what he needs to. And that's not to say that we should be that we shouldn't worry about our actions or worry about our standard of righteousness, but that when God wants to deliver his people, he can deliver them even through some very imperfect people. And God has the ability to put us into people's lives, to accomplish work through us, even with our failures, even despite our failures. So, question number 7. What does Jephthah do to try to deliver the people?
Even before we get to that, it's pretty interesting that in verse 23 he says, isn't it true that you possess what, or 24, you possess whatever God, your God, drives out from you, and we possess everything our Lord drives out before us. So even in there he's saying, you worship this idol, let's see what happens. Is God going to give us this victory, or is he going to give, or is your God going to give you the victory?
Yeah.
And that plays out in itself. And of course, we know then that Jephthah makes a rash decision.
Yeah, but no, I think bringing this up is good, and that's we need to talk about this, and that's what I have down for question 7 first, even before his vow, talking about this conversation with the king of Ammon, that he, as you mentioned before, is able to go through some history and say, this is the land that our God gave to us, and we, our ancestors were mistreated when we were coming through, not even allowed to pass through peacefully. And now we have this land because our God gave it to us. You have the land that your God gave to you. We have the land that our God gave to us. And so you don't need to think that we have wronged you in some way, and we don't need to be at war with you. We'll just have the land that our gods gave to us. Maybe a slightly weird way of wording that. You could probably interpret that a few different ways on whether that's going to be accommodative to what the king of Ammon would believe and would maybe understand. Or maybe you get some inklings that Jephthah still has some polytheistic thinking. I think that is actually probably true to some degree based off of what happens next. But all the same, this isn't a terrible way to explain things to the king of Ammon, that our God has given us this land, and so we rightfully possess it.
Well, he did try diplomacy first.
Right. Yes, if there's a way to put an end to the war without any further fighting, let's do that. Again, not a horrible option. It's well worth trying. Doesn't work here, because diplomacy doesn't always work, but it was worth a try.
Mighty warrior would suggest diplomacy rather than
Yeah.
just going in and wiping everybody out.
Yeah, it is. That's a level of nuance that you don't necessarily expect from Jephthah. With everything that we've known about him so far, he does kind of stymie the expectation there a little bit on The fact that as you go, like, you think things are going to be worse than they are, and then there's some glimmers that look decent from him, and then it's going to go downhill again.
Well, he kind of acts as a king. He's approaching a king, and he seems to approach him on the same level.
Yeah.
So he more or less seems to consider himself a king.
Yeah, and his basis for doing so is that he's kind of addressed the people before this earlier in the chapter. That he's saying, verse 9, if you bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head. And the elders of Gilead said to Jepthah, the Lord will be witness between us if we do not do as you say. So Jepthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. So he has some authorization to do this, to kind of speak on behalf of the people. But again, there is sort of this worrisome idea of that these judges and people keep trying to establish themselves as kings, right? If you believe that Jair was doing that, Abimelech was not a judge but was doing that. Jepthah seems to be putting himself up in that way. This all leads us into 1 Samuel pretty solidly, doesn't it? This desire to have a king didn't come from nowhere, right? Mark?
It's good that he still has brothers who are still alive.
Yeah.
Which adds some nuance to that whole part of the story where he doesn't rise up against his brothers and try to destroy them, even though he is this great warrior.
Yeah.
They must have been good warriors as well to
Yeah.
be able to stand up to him. They had to do it collectively.
Mm-hmm.
But they must have been capable themselves, or otherwise he would have seen, I think he would have seen something different. And it's also interesting in 10 and 11, I'm glad you parted those two verses out. They're talking in regards to Jehovah God.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a basic, there seems to be some understanding about who needs to be in charge of the, who are we making the oath under.
Right. Yeah, so he's done a little better of an Abimelech here in that he's been rejected by his brothers, but he doesn't come back to execute them one by one like Abimelech did with his half-brothers. He does negotiate with them, and he is kind of made leader over them, so that's a good thing. And then yes, this idea that they're making this vow before Jehovah. They understand something about God. As far as Israel has fallen, they have not completely forgotten about God, and they do still understand something. Jepthah understands some things about the covenant, some things about the people's history. They're not completely ignorant, but they're also not particularly righteous. Dave.
I find a parallel with between Jepthah and God. Because God, what does he say? That if you treat the instrument or if you let me be your leader, then I'll protect you. And that means you accept it, you back him and everything.
Yeah.
What did he do? He said, yeah, I'll be your leader, and take you back home, and after it's over,
No.
I continue to be your leader.
Yeah. Can't
It's
just.
kind of like, it's weird, because you look at God,
Mm-hmm.
it's like what God was saying.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if God's influencing him right now.
Yeah.
Because that's really what needed to happen.
Yeah. You can't just want my help when things are bad. You can't just use me to bail you out of trouble. Like, you have to want me as your leader when times are good
It
too.
always happens.
Yes.
It always happens.
Yes, that is the whole story of Judges and the story of Israel's history as a whole. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, head and leader were two different things. At first, they just asked him to be their head. They didn't ask him to be the leader. And he kind of turned that around on them and ended up being both.
Yeah.
The words are different and they mean a different thing. And the leader was more important than the head.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely reinforcing the idea here that I want to rule over you. I want to be over you. If you want to give me the responsibility of delivering you, you have to also give me the authority to rule over you both now and after the deliverance. Those are the conditions, and they're okay with that. All right, I want to talk about Jephthah's vow. We can't miss that. Okay, so the diplomacy fails. It's going to go back to war. What does Jephthah vow?
Sacrifice the person that came to meet him when he got home.
Yeah. Yeah, so he asks God, prays to God, that if you will give me victory over the Ammonites, then I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out of my home when I return home. And you gotta know that in the kinds of homes that they had then, that there was a room that would have housed animals as well. So you could very realistically expect for an animal to come out and for that to be the thing that you're going to sacrifice. And I do think, based on his surprise later, that that is what he was expecting. So they do get victory over Ammon. They're able to drive them out. They're able to have a total and complete victory. But this vow is weird. It's weird because it's not necessary on any level. Like, nobody else prior to this needed to make such a vow. If Jephthah listened to the thing that he already told the king of Ammon, then he would have known that this vow wasn't necessary. He said, if God will give us the victory, then we will maintain this land. This will be our land. If he believed that, then all he needs to do is appeal to God, obey God, and this can go just fine. Yet he makes the vow anyway, and we need to understand why. The vow was reflective of what the pagans did with their gods. And this is why I think that Jephthah still has a polytheistic idea of the supernatural. Because the pagans would make these kinds of deals. They believed that their gods needed to be manipulated with deals and elaborate actions so that they could gain a level of control over their god and the end that they wanted. So it was like plunging your hand into this raging river, and it's so powerful that you could do something really outstanding to get some level of control over it and to shift that power just for a moment to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. It was a very mystical, pagan idea. We see that a similar thing happened with the prophets of later on that Carmel when they are cutting themselves to make this elaborate show of attention, to try to manipulate Baal into doing something for them. This is what the pagans believed they needed to do. And so Jephthah is treating Yahweh like one of these pagan gods. This vow was not demanded by God. It was not approved of by God. It was not necessary in any way, but it happened. So he is victorious. He returns home, and it's not an animal that comes out to meet him. It's his daughter, who is his only child. He has no other sons or daughters besides her. She is deeply sad. He is deeply sad once they learn what needs to happen. And you can't just go back on a vow. That's not right. That's not that is lying to God, and that is breaking your word. Numbers 30 and verse 2 tells us that it's a sin to break a vow. At the same time, there is a provision for something like this that Jephthah could have known and could have used. Leviticus 27, 1 through 8 talks about a vow involving a human life, whether that's going to be like a sacrifice, which isn't really proper, or pledging somebody's life to service to God for the rest of their lives. And it gives a price to redeem that vow. Because you can't just ignore the vow, you can't just pretend it never happened. But on something as serious as a human life, you can redeem that person's life with a certain amount of money. So Jephthah's daughter did not need to die on many levels. The vow never needed to be made in the first place and shouldn't have if Jephthah understood who Yahweh was and what the covenant really entailed. And even afterwards, there was still an opportunity for him to redeem her life had he known the covenant. Dave.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I'm at a paradox here because he asked God to sin against himself because God sinned for human sacrifice.
Yeah.
He's asking God to approve a sinful act here.
Yeah.
And go along with it. So maybe next week you can talk more about that because I'm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well,
Did he kill her? Did he kill her?
I think he did. Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of weird because it's asking God, yeah, go ahead and kill her. I'll keep your vow.
Yeah.
You know, God could easily have given him a way out.
Well, that's what Leviticus 27 is. Like, there is that way out there. There is a way to redeem her life. And God has already made that information available too. Just because Jephthah doesn't know it or ignores it and believes he still needs to do this, that's Jephthah's fault and not God's. Mark?
We can discuss it next week, but the rabbi interpretation, the Hebrew interpretation could be and or. So what he could have said was, the first thing that comes out of my house as a Nazirite vow for a person, or I will burn if it's an animal. So we can talk about
Yeah. Well, we'll talk some more about that next week. We just kind of ran out of time. But a little bit more on Jephthah's vow, and then we'll move on to chapter 12. Thank you.